It was the bus that was the darling of Scotland, Manchester and Birmingham, but London hated them. The bus that was big in China but small in Chingford. And it was Coventry's answer to the Leyland Atlantean. Join me then on a journey into the history of the Daimler Fleetline. The game-changing rear-engined Atlantean had entered production in 1958. And the bus industry and the bus manufacturing industry both knew that this was something big and something different. However, as I have said in the past, the bus industry is very reserved and it's rather more evolutionary than revolutionary. So it perhaps wasn't so surprising when it took 2 years for the first competitor to the Leyland Atlantean to appear. This first competition appeared from Daimler, when the prototype Daimler Fleetline was unveiled at the 1960 Commercial Motor Show, which was held at Earl's Court in London. Now it's almost like Daimler had looked at the Leyland Atlantean, taken a step back and said, well, we can do that an awful lot better. Unlike the Leyland Atlantean, it was fitted with a drop centre rear axle, which meant it would work as a standard height bus or a low height bus. Unlike the Atlantean, which at the time had a conventional rear axle, which meant that if you wanted a low height Atlantean, you had to make do with a semi-low bridge design in the upper deck. Although the prototype, shown here 7000 HP wearing Birmingham City Transport livery, was powered by a Daimler CD6 8.6 litre engine, the standard engine offered initially was a Gardner 6LX, which was a 10.45 litre diesel, or a 8.4 litre Gardner 6LW, which was the lower powered option. For those of you under 30 years old, the Gardner engine at the time and up until probably the 1990s was the engine of choice for bus installations. Totally reliable and bulletproof, and very, very, very economical. They were absolutely loved by the engineering departments of all bus companies, and this is why it was such a good choice for Daimler to have that as an option on their rear engine double-decker bus. So coupled to the ability to make this a truly low height bus and have a very popular engine make installed as well, Daimler also decided to simplify the drivetrain, and they made the engine and the gearbox separate with the aid of a very, very small drive shaft between the two. This would mean in the event of a unit failure that it would in theory be simpler to change a gearbox or an engine. Fleetline production was pretty slow off the mark, with just 11 delivered in 1961. But by 1962 Daimler were getting into 3-figure numbers, and its sales started to skyrocket. Being fairly local to Coventry, where the Fleetline was produced, it was no surprise that Birmingham City Transport and its successor West Midlands PTE began to operate a large fleet of the type. Indeed, even before the formation of the PTE, there was always a strong pressure to buy local products from the Midland operators, as they like to support local industry. But this didn't stop the Fleetline being popular with other operators as well. In the early days of production, the Fleetline proved very popular with some of the BET fleets. For Midland Red, this virtually became the standard double-decker bus, while companies such as Northern General, Trent, Potteries and Maidstone and District also took sizable batches. In the municipal and big city fleets, the Fleetline sold as well too, with cities such as Nottingham, Sheffield, Manchester and Middlesbrough dual sourcing on Atlanteans as well as Fleetlines. Also from 1965, the Daimler Fleetline sold very well in Scotland, where it became almost the standard rear-engine double-decker bus for the Scottish bus group. In 1965, London Transport purchased 8 Fleetlines. These were bodied by Park Royal and were powered by Gardner engines, and were destined for a trial against a sizable fleet of 50 Leyland Atlanteans. The effect of these trials showed the Fleetline, as far as London Transport were concerned, was the much more superior bus, but more on that later. In Hong Kong, the Fleetline proved very, very successful as well, with both CMB and KMB taking large quantities of the type. Also, Citybus and Argos also ran Fleetlines in their services in Hong Kong as well. The buses allegedly performed well with the heat, the exceptional loading conditions and the heavy traffic that is prevalent in that part of the world. China Motor Bus ended up purchasing 336 new Fleetlines, while Kowloon purchased 450. A lot of these buses were known as jumbos because of their size and were named after the 747 jumbo jet. These were all later supplemented by 207 former London Transport DMS Fleetlines. From 1962, a 26-foot long version of the Fleetline appeared. This was for Walsall Corporation and had no front overhang and a sliding door behind the front axle. A later version with a slightly truncated front overhang appeared, and Walsall went on to have 98 of these strange looking little buses, the production ones being a mix of 27 and 28 foot long. There were 360 single-decker Fleetlines built. 280 of these were a 30-foot long version of the Fleetline chassis, and were mostly produced in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when there was a bit of a fad for high-capacity single-decker buses. On the whole, you would be hard to tell it was a Daimler Fleetline under that single-deck bodywork, apart from a batch that was produced for Birmingham City Transport in 1965, which were bodied by Marshall of Cambridge and contained the telltale Daimler Fleetline rear-engine boot at the back end. They didn't look odd at all, did they? The 33-foot long version of the Daimler Fleetline chassis had been available since 1966 and again proved fairly popular with some operators. These probably would have been more popular had it not been for our old friend the bus grant. You remember our chum that killed off the Bristol VRL? Well, it turns out the government and the bus grant didn't like 33-foot long double-decker buses either. As we're talking about strange Fleetline variations, it might be worth mentioning this. This is the Daimler CRC 636. And it was of a very similar design to the Bristol VRL that we spoke about earlier on. The front half of the chassis, though, was basically a Daimler Fleetline, but it did have a front-mounted radiator, and the engine was lengthways behind the rear axle. Powered by Cummins V6 engine, wow, they must have sounded lovely. 16 were built for Johannesburg, and 1 was built for Walsall Corporation in England. But yes, you've guessed it, this idea was killed off by the bus grant as well. As I mentioned previously, London Transport put a small batch of 8 Daimler Fleetlines into trials with 50 Leyland Atlanteans in 1965. With its separate engine and gearbox, the Fleetline proved to be a better prospect for London Transport. Around this same time, London Transport were designing their own rear-engine bus. This was going to be the ill-fated FRM AEC Routemaster, the front entrance rear engine Routemaster, and there was only ever one of these things built. However, politics decreed that London Transport should buy more off-the-peg buses rather than having bespoke ones specifically made for them. Plus, on top of that, Leyland and AEC were starting to get slightly itchy feet about providing a bus that would only meet the requirements of London Transport. In 1968, Ralph Bennett moved from Manchester City Transport down to London Transport, where he became effectively the chief executive. Mr. Bennett had been involved in the design of the Mancunian double-decker in Manchester, and it had been responsible for introducing one-person operated Atlanteans and Fleetlines across that city. It was this design that he wanted to bring to London to implement one-person operation and help bring down the operation costs of London Transport. Already, London Transport had been dabbling with rear-engine, high-capacity, standee, single-deck buses, and these hadn't been too successful, so a lot of hope was pinned on this new design, and London Transport christened it the Londoner. But they received the class designation of DMS, the DMS classification standing for Daimler Standee. The boxy modern bodywork was either by Park Royal or MCW. To a common design, although there were detailed differences. The engines were either Gardner 6LXBs or Leyland 0680s. Interestingly, LT specified that the bodywork must be removable, as was the case with the RT and the RM. This was to make the DMS fit in with the LT overhauling system at Aldenham. But while the MCW bodies were removable, it seemed that Park Royal didn't get the memo. When DMS1 went into Aldenham for a full overhaul in 1976, the body and chassis was separated, but the body severely distorted. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the whole history of the DMS here. I will be doing a separate video on the DMS at a later date, and it will be covered in detail then. DMS 1 and 2 were exhibited at the British Commercial Motor Show in September 1970. From October 1970, the DMSs started entering service. By the time the last Fleetline was delivered in 1978, London Transport would become the largest operator of the Fleetline in the UK, with a fleet of 2,646 in total. Although the fleet was only intact for several months, that might even be several weeks, due to withdrawals due to accident damage and fire damage. Later, DMs and DMSs were built to the quiet Fleetline standard. Now, this was basically to the similar style of the VRT3, which we covered in a previous video, an attempt to make the noise levels of the vehicles a little bit quieter by moving the air intake and outtake up the bodywork. This actually reduced drive-by sound levels down to 82 decibels, so it did actually work. These Fleetlines fitted with this quiet pack were known as the B20 Fleetlines. They featured a lightly turbocharged Leyland engine. By 1979, withdrawals of the DMSs had started, and thanks to the well-known dealer Enzyme Bus of Essex, many DMSs found new homes with other operators, including the National Bus Company and many private and individual owners as well. Many also found their way abroad, with 207 going to Hong Kong to be operated by China Motor Bus, where they operated in much more arduous conditions than they did in London. There are many opinions on the DMS. Over the years, lots of people have said the type wasn't particularly well suited to London, and London should have built its own style of one-person operated bus. You've got to remember it was a very advanced bus for its time, and London Transport were more used to dealing with the outdated design of the Routemaster and had its own very finicky maintenance and overhaul regimes. It's worth mentioning while we're here that South Yorkshire took a couple of batches of lookalike DMS buses. Although they weren't quite to the same specification as the London Transport DMSs, these had a more low driving position and no power steering. The overall body style was still the same. The Gardner 6 LXB engine became an option from 1967, and the 6LW option was withdrawn in 1969. From 1970, the Leyland 0680 engine also became another option, and this allowed Leyland to stop building the low-height Leyland Titan. This marriage of the Daimler Fleetline and the Leyland engine was a taster of things to come, and was the first signs of the Leyland ownership of Daimler, with Daimler by now a subsidiary of the Leyland Truck and Bus division. Towards the end of 1973, Leyland started putting their mark on the Fleetline a little bit more. The original Daimler chassis code, which was CR, which was chassis rear-engined, or some would say Coventry rear-engined, was replaced by FE, which was in line with the Atlantean's AN, and the FE stood for Fleetline. This was followed by the chassis length in feet, and then, as with the original Daimler chassis number, it was followed by the type of the engine, with L for Leyland or a G for Gardner. In 1973, Fleetline production was moved from Coventry to Leyland in Lancashire. The last Coventry built bus was for China Motor Bus and left Coventry factory on the 30th of September. The Coventry Works had built a staggering 7,224 Fleetlines over the course of production. As the 1970s started to draw to a close, the Fleetline was still proving a very popular bus with fleets like Thames Down and Greater Manchester Transport. But by now, British Leyland were looking for a replacement for not only the Fleetline but the Atlantean and the Bristol VR as well. This appeared as the B45, which was eventually called the Leyland Olympian. While the Atlantean soldered on for a few more years, the Olympian marked the end of production for the Fleetline and the VRT. The Fleetline was still proving a very popular bus in Scotland, and the last deliveries to the Scottish bus group appeared in 1980. Now, the interesting thing about the end of Fleetline production is that the last chassis was built in September 1980, but because of a backlog at Leyland, this wasn't released to the bodybuilders for some time after that. And then the chassis, of course, had to be slotted into the bodybuilders' schedule as well. The result being that that very last chassis wasn't delivered to its operator until December 1981. This appeared as SCH117X for South Notts and had Eastern Coachworks bodywork. Now, this bodywork was the last of the rounded traditional style ECW bodywork as well. The very last Fleetlines to enter service were for Cleveland Transport and were a batch with Northern Counties bodywork. Amazingly, they didn't enter service until the end of 1982. Receiving Y plates in the process. Despite the end of production, Fleetlines continued to play a huge part in the bus industry. For many years, they were swapped, sold, mixed and matched amongst various bus operators and companies and subsidiaries. In the mid to late 1980s, during the early years of deregulation, like the VR, the Fleetline became a very valuable tool, with many small independent companies starting up using Daimler Fleetlines and Leyland Fleetlines as well. Over the years, many Daimler and Leyland Fleetlines have been open-topped, and this has helped extend their service lives dramatically. The most obvious ones being the former London DMS class Fleetlines that for many years plodded around London on the sightseeing tours with big bus company and such. Many of these were exported to America, where they saw further use with Big Apple tours and further subsidiaries of the big bus company in Philadelphia and places like that. Also, like many other types of double-decker bus, Fleetlines have ended up as exhibition units. This is the supercar, and this was used to advertise travel cards for London in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It's part bus, part tube, part train. If you thought that was a strange use for a bus, one has even been used on Top Gear as a stunt bus to jump over some motorcycles. Unfortunately, neither bus nor motorcycles came out of this particularly well, and the poor old bus was later scrapped. And indeed, this is a fate that awaited many Fleetlines. After being in use all day, every day, and leading a full service life, engine gearbox failures, chassis failures and bodywork failures tend to lead buses into the one-way ticket to Barnsley. But as we say, you can't save them all, and the good thing is that a lot of the parts from these buses would have been put to good use to keep other Daimler Fleetlines and Leyland Fleetlines on the road. There are a respectable number of Fleetlines in preservation. Not as many probably as Atlanteans and VRs, but there's still a sizable amount. And there's some really nice ones around, like this 1969 ex-East Kent Park Royal bodied bus, which incidentally I used to travel to school on many years ago. If you have any memories or recollections of Daimler Fleetlines, I'm always pleased to hear them in the comments section below. Also, put in there where you come from. It's nice to know where the videos are reaching around the world. I do hope you enjoyed this Gardner powered low height version of Bus Histories. If you did, please like and share this video amongst your unsuspecting friends and family. I'm sure they won't mind you spamming them with such a quality product. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, as this will keep you in the loop when I make further releases in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye.